Hi, everyone. My name is Madeline Brown, and I am one of the mentors here on AMP Honors Program.
I'm Julianna, and I'm also one of the mentors here on the AMP Honors Program.
I'm Riley, and I'm also one of the mentors in the AMP Honors Program.
And us three are here today because we've each participated in a global health experience or like global medical mission trip. And we all just wanted to share some of, a little bit of our experiences, our main takeaways, and also, common questions that students might ask before thinking about going on a medical mission trip and all of that. So I've done 3 medical mission trips with Vita Volunteer. It's an organization that works with 3 Central American countries. So all 3 of my trips were to Guatemala over the past 3 years. I went every January. And these trips were incredible. As a volunteer, I learned a ton, both on the clinic side of things, but also on the cultural side of things. And we'll get into more of that later. But it was kind of a highlight of my undergrad career, going on these medical mission trips, and I would highly, highly recommend other students who are going into healthcare to consider experiences like these.
And I also was able to go with Madeline just this past January to Guatemala, also with Vita Volunteer. And like Madeline had touched on, it was a life-changing experience. When you get back, you have a lot of people asking you, like what it was like, and it's kind of hard to put your days into words and to try to describe to anyone what it was like unless they were really there.
And I did not go with Vita Volunteer with them, but I went on a different trip to Costa Rica with FIMRC Club, which is a club at UWL. It's FIMRC. It's the Foundation for International Medical Relief of Children. It was a club I joined with a friend, and we had a great time there. We only spent a week. I think the Vita Volunteer is a 2-week trip, but we still had like a ton of time for all the little things to do, and all the volunteering, the medical side, and all the culture experiences too. So.
And so our days as volunteers, and at least I'll let Riley speak to this because he, like you said, he went with FIMRC, but with Vita Volunteer, it was a 2-week trip, and our days were very different because some days were devoted to the clinic, and then so we had 6 clinic days total, and then the rest were we had recreation days and travel days interspersed between those 6 clinic days. And just a brief overview of the clinic days, because I think it's important to just give a little bit of background, is basically we would break up into groups of 3 students, and each group of 3 students would have an interpreter working with them to help with the language barrier. And so basically as volunteers, we would just help with patient intake. So asking questions, intake questions, obtaining vital signs, and then basically really just working with the doctors and healthcare providers that were on our team and letting them explain to us. It was almost like a mini shadowing experience because they would explain to us the diagnosis that they would come to and make and how they arrived at that diagnosis, and then the prescriptions that they were prescribed from that point on and why. So like understanding the entire intake process, differential diagnosis process. And so we were able to like kind of shadow that experience, but also help in like reaching that decision and asking questions and whatnot. So that was kind of our role as volunteers. And then the recreation side of things was awesome as well, because that's where you really get to learn about a lot of the cultural side of Guatemala in this instance as well.
So for my trip, it was just a week, so we didn't have as much time for the recreational side of things as they probably did. But we got there on, I believe it was like a Sunday, and we spent the afternoon with our host family, who I had Grandma Carmen. I was lucky to get her. And she was awesome, and she didn't speak like a lick of English, but she's done this before, so she kind of knew what to expect. And then, so the clinic days were structured. We had 3 different roles. We had probably a smaller group than they did too, but we had 3 different roles. There was like patient intake, where they would take vitals and get like the patient signed in. Then there was the pharmacy, which you would get orders from the doctor and then like bag up the meds. And then there was also just working in the office with the physician, and just like Maddie said, just shadowing and kind of trying to follow along as best you can. And then we did have like 1 or 2 days to ourselves where we got to experience a lot of culture. We like visited like a market. That was a lot of fun. And then we went to a beach on the way back to the airport. So
what were, some of your guys' fears going into an experience like this? What were your concerns?
Going into it, my fears were, first and foremost, I hadn't taken Spanish since high school. So knowing that that was the primary language and means of communication in Guatemala, I was fearful of not, one, disrespecting their culture in a way, just because, you don't know how to converse with them. And two, safety was also a big fear of mine as well. When it came to becoming sick, possibly, or just, you don't know your surroundings as much as you do when you're here in America. So those, I would say, were my top two concerns going into the trip.
Yeah, as far as being able to speak a native language, I also I hadn't taken Spanish since high school, but I had felt like semi-confident in my skills, and I ended up being one of the ones, unfortunately, probably, or fortunately, how you look at it, but one of the ones that knows Spanish the best in my group. So I kind of played like a mini interpreter role, but a lot of if you go with like a bigger, if you go with like a bigger like group, they typically can accommodate your groups because it's not necessarily a Spanish mission trip. It's more of a medical mission trip. So they don't expect everyone to know Spanish necessarily, or whatever language you go to.
Yeah, same experience here. I mean, I was a Spanish minor, so I knew I could converse pretty well with my homestay family and also, in the clinic and whatnot. But that, not every student is like that, and it wasn't a requirement to go on the trip. So like Riley said, like most organizations, like global health experiences that you do have, most organizations you travel with are very accommodating in that they, provide you with interpreters because they don't expect you to come down and know how to speak Spanish or whatever language it might be. It's very it's geared toward the medical side, as Riley had said. So talking about the costs of these trips, that is a big factor for any person, any student who's looking to go. For Vita Volunteer, I know the cost was right around $2,000 for the 2-week trip. The only thing that cost didn't include was like fun money, like souvenir money, and then your flight. So at the end of the day, I know most students were paying around $2,500, give or take, depending on what kind of a deal they could get on their flights. And that's an investment. That's a lot of money. But there are many fundraising opportunities to, raise money for a trip like this. And usually if you explain your why you want to do this and make it personal, like to your family, your close family, friends, start a fundraiser. A lot of people do like shoe drives or, car washes, like anything, any little bit helps to, make the incremental payments that you do make to go on these trips. To make it affordable and more affordable for you. But yeah, there's a lot of different fundraising opportunities, and we can talk more like offline about those, and because some people have really gotten creative. But out of time's sake, I know that's obviously another big concern of students, just being able to afford it, and understandably, because it is expensive to travel and go on trips like these. Next, so what would you guys say that some of your biggest takeaways were from the global health experience that you had?
Really, I'll let you go first with this one.
Oh, wow. Okay. So for me, I think like one of the things I didn't really think about before the trip was how these doctors that work down there also work in the US, and like if they raise a family while simultaneously doing both of those things too, how that all works. Because if this is something that I want to do later on, like how feasible is it for me to like make this work? And so the doctors that I had on my site for the week that I was there, it was a mom and dad doctor family, and that's obviously convenient, but they had 2 kids and they just homeschooled them essentially I think they were in 6 months Costa Rica and then 6 months in the US. I believe they lived in Washington State. And so they held like a practice in Washington, but they also held a practice in Costa Rica. And there were a lot of I had asked them about it a lot because I was interested in it, but they worked with a private practice in Washington State that allowed them to leave for such a long extended period of time. But they were able to make it work, and their kids were so funny and so smart, and they were obviously bilingual because they've grown up in both cultures. So I thought that was a really cool opportunity, and it was something that I learned about that I didn't really think about going into it.
I would say there's probably 2 things that I noticed in myself, I would say. The first one was active listening. I think this is something that I'm not always the best at. And so going on this trip, not only not understanding the language, but also a lot of the conditions that you see, you don't always see here in America. So active listening was huge for me when we would do, the patient intake and asking the questions and just watching body language and how you can just recognize pain just from that alone. So practicing my active listening skills was huge for me on this trip, and I think that will be a huge takeaway for me in my future as a nurse, because I will be doing that with patient intake here in America, and you'll need that regardless, in whatever you may do.
And for me, my biggest takeaways, there are also a few, just because these were such loaded experiences. But I think first and foremost was me personally recognizing what I take for granted in my life, and the things that I have here that I'm very grateful for. And traveling to Guatemala and seeing, how in some of the communities we visited, life is very simple. It was a moment of humility for me, and I've brought that back home with me, and am much more grateful for the things that I do have here, and it has motivated me to want to give more, and so that's something I'm very grateful for. It's just because all the things that I've seen in Guatemala and the people I've interacted with have really showed me how grateful I am for what I do have, and how much I want to give back to not only my own community, but for, global communities like in Guatemala. And then second of all is more on the clinical and medical side, is just another big takeaway is like learning how to ask questions in the clinic, and how what a patient says, can help you to think of what the next question to ask, and there being strategy behind the questions that you ask.
And just to add to your part, Madeline, about the cultural side of things, I think too, and the humility side of it, where what I noticed for a lot of the Guatemalan people was their appreciation for the simplistic lifestyle and the just living in such a minimalistic way. And like you said, like you take that home with you and you recognize that you don't need all of these, tangible things back home, and it's all about like your values and your morals and your friendships and relationships that you create with people. And I think that was also a huge takeaway for me as well.
Okay, last but not least, our very last question here is, why would you recommend a global clinical experience to other pre-health students who are maybe thinking about doing something like this?
It's such a unique experience, that you only get a few chances to get, especially as organized and as in depth as this is with the Vita or with the FIMRIC club. It's one thing to kind of solo it and go down by yourself, maybe during a gap year or something, but it's another thing to have all this organization already planned and everything already kind of put out for you, so you can kind of just get into the thick of it with all the medical volunteering and all those different things. And once you get into medical school, or whatever graduate school you're going into, your time is definitely more limited, and just kind of finding out if this is something for you or something that you may be interested in, so that you don't have to waste a rotation necessarily on global health if you don't necessarily like it, or if it's not for you. Just kind of exploring and expanding your viewpoints is a huge thing.
I think a big thing for me would be the connections you make with different people that you go on the trip with. So I went with Madeline, like I had said in the beginning, and her and I are very close. We're very good friends. And I think a big thing, not only going with her and experiencing it with her, but also the new friendships that I created and the networks that you create with anyone on the trip. And it's a conversation point. Even when you come back here, you're still friends with all of the individuals that went. And from there, it's, you're all going into the same field and the same interests, and that can grow and expand in its own way back when you do return back to America and continue on your education path. So a big thing was the friendships and the networking that I created on the trip.
Definitely. And mine would just be, be willing to, this is one of those experiences that pushes you out of your comfort zone entirely. And that's when you're going to learn the most about yourself, about other people, meeting other people. Like Julianna said, the networking piece is huge. But yeah, just being willing to push yourself out of your comfort zone, and, being able to later down the road speak to those experiences and what you did learn about yourself. All of that, those are huge application builders, and more than that, but you carry that with you for the rest of your life, and the lessons that you do learn along the way. So I think that's a good way to wrap up this discussion on global health experiences. And if you do have any questions, there's a ton, this is a loaded topic. So like I said, we only scratched the surface. But if you guys do have any questions about trips, about our own experiences, about a certain organization, please do message us or comment on this post, and we'll definitely get those answered for you, because I think we've all had, a pretty wide array of different global health experiences.
Happy travels.